The proclamation of the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. After he had fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
In times of difficulty or in need, we find it natural or normal to turn to the Lord. But we are reminded today, my dear friends, we must learn not only in times of difficulty or in need, we must learn as well to turn to God at all times. My dear friends, looking into the liturgical readings of today, the 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time, in today's first reading, taken from the first book of Kings, chapter 19, verse 9 and verses 11 to 13, it is described, fleeing for his life, the prophet Elijah fled into the desert, and then he took refuge in the desert, where he encountered God. And when he encountered God inside the cave, he is taught by God, and that is, God's ways are not man's ways. Inside the cave, Elijah is taught by God that God's approach is as gentle as a breeze. And if we look into the gospel reading of today, taken from the Gospel of Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33, again the gospel describes to us when the apostles are caught in the high winds and rough seas, Jesus comes to them. And what does Jesus do? Upon coming to the apostles, that is in the midst of the high winds and rough seas, afloat on water, Jesus calms their fears and brings them peace. My dear friends, sisters and brothers, it is said, some people think that if we have enough and sufficient faith, some people think that life, your life, my life, our lives will be smooth and plain sailing. But that is not true. Even if we have enough faith, my dear friends, our life, our journey will not be plain and smooth sailing. In other words, faith does not shield us from the hard knocks of life and death. Faith does not shield us from the rough strikes and hard blows again of life and death. And we see this, my dear friends, in the particular things I would like to share with you today, with my topic, calm or calm in the storm. We see this in the case of the prophet Elijah, as described in today's first reading. Elijah undoubtedly was a man of faith. But after his objection to idolatry, Queen Jezebel wanted to kill Prophet Elijah. So he took refuge in a cave. He fled to the desert again, where in the cave he experienced the presence of God. And then, strengthened by the presence of God inside the cave, then and only then Elijah was able to go on with his mission. We see the same thing in the lives of the early Christians. They too were people of faith. But what happened? After the early Christians had experienced and encountered persecutions, people running after their lives, they thought that God has abandoned them, and their faith began to wilt or to waver. Only then, my dear friends, when they discovered that even though Jesus God was not physically with them, God was always with them, and God could always help them. And then their faith revived, and the early Christians were able to face what we call trials and dangers in their lives. Another example in the life of Peter. My dear friends, the example of Peter as described in the gospel today is especially enlightening. The story of Peter beginning to sink and being saved by Jesus God is a very strange one. It represents something that really did happen to Peter. And it is, mind you, in reference to the failure of Peter during the passion of Jesus, where he denied Jesus 3 times. And after resurrection, the restoration of the faith of Peter, when he said, "My Lord and my God." Initially, my dear friends, Peter is full of faith as he sets across the water toward Jesus. And we remember the brave words of Peter at the Last Supper. "Lord, I am ready to die with you if necessary." But then come what we call doubt and cowardice in Peter. And Peter begins to think that Jesus had to rescue him. Peter, my dear friends, represents the typical disciple of the present day that is caught between doubt and faith. It is very comforting for us to see at times that the apostles and the early Christians were weak and fearful. In other words, they are just like us. Yes, at the start of an adventure, my dear friends, we may be convinced that we have full faith. But as we go on in our respective journeys and adventures in life, as we go along and difficulties and trials arise, then, my dear friends, as these difficulties and trials arise, we discover that we have very, very little faith. It is then, my dear friends, that we turn to the Lord for help. It is in our weak moments, my dear friends, that we experience the strength of God. If we never felt ourselves going down and under every day, as I said, to the hard knocks of life and death, if we never felt ourselves going down and under, we would never know the restoring power of God. Going back then to faith, faith does not save us from trials and tribulations. What it does, it gives us the strength, my dear friends, to face trials and tribulations. The person who has faith has the source of strength and inspiration, especially when trouble strikes. And let me repeat again, I used to share this with you. It is not we who keep the faith. It is the faith that keeps us going. And this is being confirmed by Mahatma Gandhi when he said, the person who has even a grain of faith in the Lord, that person never loses hope in the middle of trials and tribulations. And how about the person without faith? The person without faith, on the contrary, has nowhere to turn to when trouble strikes. A person without faith, my dear friends, he or she is utterly alone, neither with strength, neither with comfort, neither with anything to be proud of. And so this leads us to the conclusion, my dear friends. Today's gospel story, taken from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Today's gospel shows us the power of faith. Today's gospel shows us what Jesus God does for his people when the wind is contrary and when his people are in danger of being overwhelmed by the storms of everyday life. To those with faith, my dear friends, Jesus is not a ghost from the past. But to those with faith, Jesus is the Son of God, whose grace upholds us when things are too much for us to handle. Remember the gospel reading of today and the message. When the apostles were caught in high winds and rough seas, Jesus came to them. Jesus calmed their fears, and Jesus brought them peace. And that is the grace of God upholding us when things are too much for us to handle. And the psalmist, my dear friends, is correct and right as we hear today the responsorial psalm from the book of Psalms chapter 85 and verses 9 to 14. Lord, let us see your kindness, and Lord, grant us your salvation. Amen.